A friend recently asked me if they should supplement omega-3s. They heard about the association between omega-3 levels and neurological disorders like dementia and Parkinson's. They also had their omega-3 index checked. And while I had much to say about the topic, I also admitted this was a topic I've been kind of putting off diving deeper into. So in this video, we're going to dive deeper into some of the literature and different schools of thoughts for omega-3s, whether you should consider supplementing them, eating more foods with omega-3s, or whether you simply just don't need to worry about it whatsoever. Alright, as you can see, I have prepared a very colorful, fun presentation. Well, I try to make it as fun as possible. First, we need to go over quickly what omega-3s are. There's two essential fatty acids, alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, and L-A-linoleic acid. I hope I said that right. I always mispronounce things. So you can check out my All About Fat video to learn more about these, but in short story is they're both polyunsaturated, meaning that they have multiple double bonds, and that's how they get their names. Can you tell which one is which? Well, omega-3 means that there's a double bond on the third carbon, and omega-6 means there's a double bond on the sixth carbon. The omega means we start counting from the end that is the opposite of the carboxyl group, also known as the methyl end. So the methyl end is this end right here, the CH3. Okay, so we can see 1, 2, 3, omega-3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, omega-6. Both these essential fatty acids use the same enzyme pathway. So you can see on the left we have our LA, and on the right we have our ALA. They're both PUFAs, which just stands for polyunsaturated fatty acid. For our ALA, we can see that it turns into EPA and DHA, as you can also tell by my very fancy, I told you it's going to be a fun presentation, very fancy animation work here. We can see that there's a series of basically reactions that come, and there's some enzymes in the middle that catalyze these reactions to turn it from that ALA to EPA and DHA. Now, importantly, we see a series of transformations, mostly elongations that occur, and we can see that both these essential fatty acids use the same enzymes. And the EPA and the DHA is probably the form you're used to seeing on supplement bottles and the form you're used to hearing about. And right away, this discussion turns into the supplement side of things. To answer the supplement question, there's two big questions. And if you've seen my other content, you already know what these are. First, what are the minimum requirements that someone needs? What's the minimum requirements we need? And after those minimum requirements, is there a benefit to getting more? As in, is there an optimal level? Well, for the minimum requirements, there's no RDA because there isn't enough precise data on population needs. There is an AI, not as an AI as an artificial intelligence, AI as an adequate intake. There is one for ALA that's set basically on the median levels of intake observed in populations with no apparent signs of deficiency and just good overall health. And you can see by this fun arrow here, the adequate intake for men is recommended at 1.6. I shouldn't say I guess recommended. It is recommended amount. But I don't want to confuse with RDAs. And then for women, it's 1.1 grams, right? And this is per day. So yeah, instead of minimum requirements, we need to frame this as adequate requirements. So what do these numbers mean for food? Well, a tablespoon of whole flax seeds is about 2.35 grams of ALA. Tablespoon of chia seeds is 1.24 grams. An ounce of walnuts, about 14 halves or 28 grams, is about 2.57 grams of ALA. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into this in this presentation, but I will in a future video. That fatty acid absorption does vary, and generally speaking, it's higher for more processed food. So in other words, if you eat some, flaxseed whole, you're probably going to poop some of that out. Some of it's going to make it down to your gut. Well, if you have that in an oil form, you're going to absorb more of those calories. It's not necessary at a loss you don't absorb all these because the unabsorbed, especially unabsorbed omega-3s, have been shown to be beneficial for having a good and healthy gut microbiome. Importantly, even without these foods, whole plant foods will have a varying amount of ALA, which all adds up. I'll have more on this when we get into different schools of thought. You also notice that I don't have any fish here. Well, fish actually have mostly EPA and DHA, which are the converted forms. And that's actually what most of this video is going to be about anyways. I have a quick little slide here on deficiency. What if I don't get enough ALA? Well, you'll get scaly, red, swollen skin, but don't worry about it. This is very, very rare. And the big reason why this is so rare is because most foods we eat have some ALA component to them. If it was more prominent, we likely would have RDAs for alpha-linolenic acid. This brings us to the next big question. Why bother to supplement at all? Which brings us to another question. How does one even measure their levels? So introducing the omega-3 index, which is basically the levels of EPA and DHA in red blood cell membranes. Typical range is less than 4% to over 8%. And it's supposed to reflect omega-3 status, and we'll get into this. And the reason one might want to measure this is because there are some associations between high and low levels. Specifically, here's an article from William Harris from 2009 titled Omega-3 Index, from Biomarker to Risk Marker to Risk Factor. Specifically, it's talking about the growing evidence for omega-3 as a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. But in order to be classified as a risk factor, there's a lot of different criteria that needs to be met. Here is the criteria that this article used. You can see it right here. If you're interested, I encourage you to take a look at the full article, but we will have some different arguments to go through today. So here's a short story. So question one is basically, do people differ in their omega-3s and have different outcomes? And this is really where the bulk of this research is. There's a lot of associative evidence. We'll get into whether this translates into causal in a moment. Now for this slide, just keep in mind, you see all these yeses and this no and this question mark. That's just what the article said. I'm just using as a quick way to summarize the article without having to go through every single point and every single study decided, because that would be a very, very long video. But you are more than welcome to do that if you would like to. Okay, anyways, this is just one analysis, and I'll show a bit more soon, because as you can see, for cardiovascular disease, it appears to give an overwhelming yes, that better levels give an indication of risk. Here's another article pointing out the connection of lower levels of EPA and DHA and sudden cardiac event. There's been a few studies that have resulted in this not only being association well known, but leading it to dietary advice to supplement DHA and EPA. So it's important to look at some of these studies and make sure they're solid. One of the most commonly cited studies is the DART study right over here. And this DART study is a randomized controlled trial that was looking at secondary prevention of having a myocardial infarction, so having another heart attack. The trial's design was simple. Participants either received dietary advice to reduce total fat intake and increase polyunsaturated fat intake, or to increase the intake of fatty fish, or to increase the intake of cereal fiber. So here's a little bit more on the advice that was given. So beyond the fatty fish, the reason this paper gets cited and mentioned is because they did use an EPA supplement for men who weren't able to tolerate fatty fish. So in short, there's just three groups here. So here's a slide just showing that they were taking this EPA supplement if they couldn't tolerate the fatty fish. And here's just three main points here. It was a 2.3 gram average intake for fatty fish, 0.7 gram average for the other subjects, 14% took capsules as complete or partial substitution. And this is crucial before conducting a larger trial to know, is dietary advice actually leading to dietary changes? And even for the supplements, is this actually making any difference? I'm sure you can already see major limitations of this work and whether it applies to you or not. First, this study is just on men that have had a heart attack. If you're not a man who already had a heart attack, then well, probably this study is not the one to base what to do on. Second, studies that give dietary advice and then use diet recall have their share of issues when it comes to reliability. But this is often the most feasible tool that researchers have. In this study, they measured dietary adherence based on questionnaires. So what did they find? Let's skip a ton of data and studies and just get to the point here. Interestingly enough, participants remaining did report some increase of fish and fiber intake. This may seem unbelievable itself, but the actual intervention was quite involved with dietitians for follow-up, and it does show that dietary habits tend to stick once they're made, for better or worse. There is an early reduction for those given fish advice, but it was followed by increased risk over the next 3 years. The fat advice group had more stroke risk, and most importantly for us, there didn't seem to be any substantial long-term survival benefit. Now, I know what you're thinking, really, survival? No, what I need to know is whether it's going to increase my quality of life, and we'll get into that. Just want to share as much of the story as I can before we start formulating conclusions. And you might also be thinking, okay, so the advice to change intakes maybe didn't pan out. What about if we know there's people that are taking more omega-3s for sure? So let's get right into this. Let's go from randomized control trial to randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Introducing the GISI trial. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right. Now, here's the abstract if you want to read it. In short story, brief story, they found a small benefit for mortality and for admission to the hospital for cardiovascular reasons. If you are interested in what they gave a grand total of both EPA and DHA. Looking at the discussion, now that we've jumped to 2008, so essentially a couple decades, there are potential mechanisms at play here which might actually explain the small effect. So we're still looking at those with cardiovascular disease. Before I get into my take, I have one more study to share, and you'll want to see this because they address some of the limitations of this study and they use a higher dose, which is this one here that looked at Japanese patients who ate a large amount of fish, so already getting a high DHA and EPA. This study also had way more endpoints, as you can see just in the yellow here. And in the blue here, you can see that this is for those patients already with coronary artery disease, and they did have a significant reduction of major coronary events, and that's using an EPA supplement. So now there's some glaring limitations here. One is looking at the Japanese, where the version of atherosclerosis, heart disease may be slightly different. And two, it's still for those that had an event already. And I guess three, that 19% number you see there in the blue, it's actually relative risk reduction. You can see the difference was 158 versus 197, or 8.7 versus 10.7%. So still significant, but when you look at the absolute number, it's not as large of a difference as it first appears. Now you might wonder, out of all the papers out there, why did I select these three papers? Am I cherry picking data here to prove some point? And honestly, I haven't looked into this topic in years, so I just did a fresh search and I'll show you how I selected these studies. These were the studies that the original paper that I had shown with that huge list and check marks had cited as being evidence for clinical outcomes. This study said these studies clearly establish a causal relationship. So let me ask you, do you agree with this statement? I, for one, have some concerns. I'm not going to go too much further into this, but you can search through it, look through it yourself. You can look through this paper, you can see the other studies cited, but I'd wager that you're going to see the same limitations and the same conclusions. So let's get into why. So what about diet? Did they look at diet? Is anyone looking at diet? Interesting enough, you can do this pretty quickly. You open a study, then search, just Control F, Command F, search diet in the document. You'd be very surprised. You'd almost think that maybe diet isn't actually just playing a role here and that's why they're not talking about it. But do you think those who have had a heart attack or heart attacks are eating a healthy diet? What about the general population? Supplementation clearly does something, or else there would just be completely null findings. But what is that something? If you remember my slide from earlier, I mentioned LA and AOA, the essential fatty acids that use the same enzymes. So there's the idea that if you get too many omega-6s, it starts to outcompete the enzymes available in order to convert the AOA to the EPA and DHA. So what you can think of as that these two have almost opposing roles. Omega-6s are typically associated with inflammation, while omega-3s seem to have an anticoagulant or an anti-inflammatory or anti-clotting effect. This brings us to the idea of an omega-6 to 3 ratio. You're going to hear about all sorts of different numbers out there on what should be optimal. Some will say it's 1-to-1, others will say it's 2-to-1, 4-to-1, 6-to-1. And we're talking about as in more omega-3s and 6s. But who's saying this? Well, researchers are saying this. The most heavily cited article I found on the topic was this one right here. So let's see what they've got to say about this omega-6 to 3 ratio. So this article claimed, as you can see in the yellow right here, they claim that there are several sources that suggest humans involved on a diet that's closer to 1-to-1 omega-6 to 3. And despite this article being from 2002, that Western ratio that they mentioned of 15-to-1, it still stands. Very quickly, they use evidence highlighted in green here that we've already seen in the secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease. And in orange over here, you'll see a suppressed inflammatory effect with a ratio of 2-to-3-to-1, which I will touch on later in this video. So let's go back to this 1-to-1 ratio. And the question I'll ask you to ponder, to think about is, do you think this ratio is actually possible? You'll see this table here shows a better ratio from plants versus animals. Remember, ALA is an omega-3 and ALA is an omega-6. And this, again, might be surprising for people, but remember, that's for ALA and LA, not for DHA and EPA. One Google search shows you that a lot of different fancy charts to show different ratios in foods. And you can also check Wikipedia. Here's for fish. That will show the fish that have higher ratios of omega-3 to 6s. And here's one for plant sources as well. As we can see, besides chia and flax, these have typically much higher ratios of omega-6 to 3. And this may seem strange. How did that lab study show plants having so much of a higher ratio of omega-3s to 6s? And it's actually because a lot of plant matter is like veggies that aren't actually considered high in omegas or fat. And in general, these will actually have ratios like 1 to 2 for lettuce, 1 to 1 for collard greens, and spinach has a ratio of 1 to 5. That's for 6s to 3s. I know it gets confusing. You'll see omega-6 to 3, you'll see 3 to 6. Anyways, this is something I'll talk more about when we get to different schools of thoughts for omega-3s. But in short, even though individually these are in low amounts, by eating a lot of them, you could dramatically change your ratio without relying on these foods that are higher in omega-3s, whether that's plant foods or fish that you saw in the previous slides. And this argument may further stand considering those foods we think of higher in omega-3s weren't necessarily the most accessible. And remember, our ancestors were inland, so most of them didn't have access to fish, and getting lots of like walnuts, flax, and chia was even tougher. And now I know what you're thinking. Okay, I get it. Omega-6 to 3 ratio matters. Ratios these days are swayed towards omega-6s. Our ancestors have limited access to omega-3 rich foods, but managed to get a better ratio from smaller quantities of foods, giving us an average of 1-to-1 ratio. And to that I'll say, well, even though that's evolutionarily in line, we still need to keep in mind, you don't necessarily want to consider evolution and nature to be optimal for your goal of living a healthy and long life. And this stands, even if it was omega-3, but I don't know, some other compound, there might still be a more optimal ratio or an amount of EPA and DHA to get for living a healthy life into old age. And this is where we shift gears. And it's one of the pieces that's been cited more and more is regarding omega-3s and brain health. Many of our ancestors didn't live into old age, much like most people do today. Okay, next slide. All right, apparently I have a reminder here for me to cool my jets because apparently I'm getting away and I didn't even finish the last topic. To answer the big question, is there a benefit for more omega-3s, specifically EPA and DHA for cardiovascular health? So looking at the structure of omega-3s again, remember those with more double bonds means more fluidity, which is why they're being credited for being less thrombotic or less clotting. Now here's where I have a bit of a, you could say fresh, or I guess more whole, big picture take on it. In articles talking about potential mechanisms for omega-3s, they seem to be missing the big part of the picture because they have a poor understanding of not omega-3s but cardiovascular disease. I think it might have to do with zeta potentials, basically helping to maintain red blood cells flexibility, which is important for when these blood cells get older and stiffer, but also important when they start sticking together because of dietary factors. I have a video talking about blood flow that covers that. But this is where I believe you're seeing the benefits. Now, overall, from my analysis, there is a clear lack of evidence for healthier populations. Some studies show associated benefits to eating more fish, but we need to dive deeper to look at, okay, what calories are being displaced if they're eating fish, right? If instead of French fries, they're eating fish, of course, that's a huge step in the right direction. My take on it when it comes to cardiovascular disease is simple. There's at least 10 more other steps that are much, much more important. Any dramatic benefit is likely from the whole foods that just happen to change that omega-3 ratio. So it's kind of like you're just looking at something that's associated, but it's not actually the reason why you're seeing that improvement, right? As for supplementing it, at best, it's very minor risk management, and studies show it to be beneficial for those who already had a cardiovascular event. I'll dive more into supplements and answer this question in a little bit more detail towards the end. But for now, we're going to go back to our original question, why bother to supplement? Now that we talked about the cardiovascular side, let's get into whether omega-3s are beneficial for brain health and our cognitive abilities. As you can see by the title here, you are relying on levels in red blood cell membranes to give you an idea of what the levels might actually be in the brain. In the brain, our cell membranes have been reported to use a significant proportion of DHA. Next slide. And lower levels are associated with Alzheimer's disease as well as DHA decreasing with typical aging. And there's a number of different mechanisms potentially at play here to explain this decline. Now, this seems relatively straightforward, but the problem is, and while this may be discussed in the literature, in lay public it's often missed, and that is, drum roll please, I actually have a, watch this. Huh? How cool is that? I have a drum roll button. Okay. You have a chicken and egg debate. What came first? Did the lower levels come first, or did the decline in cognitive function or the acceleration of dementia, did that come first that lead to the lower levels? Of course, you're going to see companies selling supplements oversell these studies, right? That should be expected. What would you do as a business owner? But that's not the point of this presentation. We're going to get into the evidence. But that being said, there's a lot of studies showing the association between omega-3 levels, and again, these are typically red blood cell levels, being associated with a variety of measures for cognitive health. Some studies do actually look at brain DHA, but that usually requires brain tissue and hence is post-mortem after death analyses. Besides that, and I'll have a study showing this, talking about this later, but you can also look at cerebrospinal fluid as an indicator of how much DHA is actually in the brain. There's some newer studies. I think there's this new technology, MRS or something. Basically, it looks at the total chemical composition. I know this table here is absolutely tiny, but the paper title is there. Feel free to take a look through if you are interested, right? I don't have time. I don't think you'd want me to make a video in that much detail. If you do, let me know. And if you did take a deeper look, you'll notice that studies are also looking at omega-3s as well as cholesterol levels, and not all these studies will actually show a positive relationship. You'll see at the bottom of the table here, the very last study. This study had a median follow-up time of 4.9 years, found no association between red blood cell, DHA, EPA, and total omega-3s and Alzheimer's disease. So what might explain the differing results? Well, other dietary factors could be at play. Basically, what does the rest of the diet look like? Other lifestyle variables, including sleep and exercise, have been shown to be protective, protecting us from that cognitive decline and maintaining our cognitive health. The form or source of omega-3 that's coming in also matters. This paper here on this slide also mentioned how fish has higher concentrations of methylmercury, which is a known neurotoxin. And as you can see by the highlighted text here, there is genetic variants that might be also a play for Alzheimer's disease, and some people may simply not benefit while others do. I came across this interesting study talking about using plasma BDNF. For those that don't know, BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is crucial for not only neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, but also helping current neurons survive. Anyways, the study mentioned how the omega-3 index, which is based on red blood cell levels, RBCs, may not be suitable for the brain because you need a unique transporter at that blood-brain barrier to actually bring it across. The blood-brain barrier is exactly what it sounds like. It is a barrier to protect the brain, help control what comes in and out, to maintain, you could say, that brain's physiological state. If this is true, that would be a major limitation of previous studies, which is why I didn't go through these studies one by one. Instead, the benefit they report for cognitive health may be because of better cardiovascular health. Better blood flow usually helps to meet neural demands better and hence lead to better brain health. In yellow here, you'll see LPC, a form of DHA that has been shown to increase brain DHA and BDNF. And in pink, you'll see this work is in rats and mice. To address these limitations, you would kind of have to poke around living people's heads, which most living people aren't super happy about. You can also see that the increase in omega-3 index was correlated with increase in plasma BDNF, and it was negatively correlated, meaning with less RBC omega-3 levels, which may be specific to the form they're using or specific to the mice and rats that have better enzymes, that might have better enzymes to better transport these fatty acids. And you know what else increases BDNF? Exercise does. Let's go. I've been standing here for a while. So there's lots of studies showcasing this. For most people, this stuff comes well before any modifying one's diet to include more omega-3s. Okay, but what's the takeaway from all this? Because there is this strong association, these levels could be an indication of people at risk for dementia and cognitive decline. And while supplementation may not have strong evidence, once you identify people or self-identify yourself, there might be some things to do for cognitive health. Like I share, exercise is one route, sleep is another. And if you've seen my other videos, diet is massive. I'm going to get into this raising levels, food, supplements more soon. But I mentioned genetics earlier. There's potentially a select case here that may influence your decision to increase your omega-3 intake. And that's only if you already know you're genetically at risk for late onset Alzheimer's disease, as in carrying the ApoE gene. If you are, then again, there's lots to do overall to decrease your risk, but I would pay attention to new research in case anything comes up. You can see that this is a paper from 2022, and the last line is that cognitive benefits for this group are yet to be determined. Okay, believe it or not, we are 52 slides in. Thanks for sticking in here. We're more than halfway through and we're getting into some of the more juicy stuff. If you're enjoying this video, please do consider subscribing. It lets me know that you enjoyed this video, which lets me know to make more content like this. And there will be more content like this, a lot more. Okay, back to the video. Summarizing thus far. So the remainder of the video is going to focus a little bit more on the need to know to let you be better equipped to answer the question on whether you want to increase or supplement those omega-3s, the AOA, the EPA, the DHA. So I did want to summarize what we talked about so far. The ratio of omega-6 to 3 likely matters for conversion because they use the same enzyme pathways. The modern foods are very high in omega-6s. Omega-3s are more fluid and hence have anti-clotting or inflammatory properties to them. ALA is the essential fatty acids, the one we need, which converts to EPA and DHA, which are the ones that studies most often look at and what most people supplement. Tests usually measure red blood cell membrane levels, and the omega-3 index is basically converting those levels into a percentage. The higher index levels are associated with better cardiovascular health outcomes for those who already have cardiovascular disease, and higher DHA levels in the brain are associated with better cognitive health. But it's unclear what leads to what, the role of diet, and whether an index, you could say based on RBCs, is the best way of looking at levels in the brain. Like cardiovascular health, there's a lot of important steps that I would say come well before omega-3s. Okay, we're gonna get into different schools of thoughts now. The conventional school of thought is meant to be evidence-based and applicable for a wider audience. There is, of course, potential influence from industry here, but that could be said the same for the individual level as well. And you might think like, okay, why are we even gonna consider what one person has to say when we can look at what multiple people have kind of come together, reaching some sort of consensus? And the reason for that is that they might be running their analysis like I do with a different lens and for different populations, sometimes for very niche populations. Okay, conventional thought. One key source out there, and honestly this is the key source we're going to talk about in this presentation, is the NIH Omega-3 Fatty Acids Factsheet for health professionals. I actually opened this up after conducting my own search, and I was pleasantly surprised that we reached similar conclusions. So here is their note on ratios right over here, simply saying that the optimal ratio hasn't been defined yet. Of course, my analysis went a little deeper into the ratio our ancestors might have had, i.e. lower omega-6s, slightly higher omega-3s. They do mention that most agree that raising EPA and DHA is more important than lowering linoleic acid or arachidonic acid, the omega-6s, which is a very instant statement that almost contradicts what the remainder of their findings say. But I'll let you make up your mind on that. They mentioned that RBC levels are typically between 3 to 5% in Western populations that have low fish intakes, and these numbers are similar to the numbers that we had seen earlier. Under their omega-3s and health section, they clearly state most research is on EPA and DHA from foods like fish or fish oil supplements rather than AOA from plant foods. You got to consider what industry decisions may be driving that. But regardless, as they put it, it's hard to say if the benefits are due to the omega-3s itself. Their cardiovascular disease section covers some of the same studies that I had run into. I know this is a lot of text, so pause if you like to read it. They walk through some of the earlier research, but then if you keep reading, they share subsequent trials that had largely null findings. And remember, even the findings they had that were beneficial were for people who already had a major cardiovascular disease event. The most recent article they cite is a Cochrane collaboration one, which found that omega-3s do reduce serum triglycerides. And this is actually something I've seen in my practice where physicians will tell their patients that have high triglycerides to take omega-3s. And that they also found that they slightly reduce cardiovascular disease and hence cardiovascular mortality. But like earlier, it was unclear if a confounding lifestyle difference in eating more fish and hence getting more omega-3s, such as like the Japanese, are actually causing this difference. And while that might seem like an unfair statement to make, the authors state themselves that supplements did not affect all-cause mortality, cardiovascular events, stroke, or even arrhythmias. So we have evidence that isolated DHA and EPA doesn't impact the most important markers that matter to us all, whether you're living longer and avoiding a heart attack or stroke. So in short, if you already had a cardiovascular event, then there might be a small benefit. But of course, talk to your doctor. They're the ones that know your risk profile best. It's interesting that in their conclusion, they talk about fish and other seafood almost as a backstep to make sure people don't take this as a don't eat fish message. Personally, I think they should have just kept it on the omega-3 topic, but totally understandable to mention that. They also have a section for Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and cognitive function. While there are some correlative findings of lower DHA levels with those with Alzheimer's, overall findings for supplements shows it does not affect cognitive function in either with those with Alzheimer's or healthy adults. Oh, next slide is on rheumatoid arthritis. So in short, there's some mixed findings. I know, right? In short, mixed findings. In short, mixed findings. Feel like a just broken record. But as mentioned earlier, there actually might be some benefit for the autoimmune side of things. On the note of autoimmune, this might actually explain why there was a study by, I think it was by Brasky, the SELECT trial that showed a link between higher omega-3 status and prostate cancer. The reason I'm not presenting that study is because the method of measure that they use looking at plasma phospholipids is reported not to be as accurate as looking at the long-term omega-3 dietary index, the RBC membrane method, which is the mentioned omega-3 index. So to conclude, but before I conclude, I'm so small, let me make myself bigger. To conclude, what does the NIH have to say about supplements? Well, the argument of supplement is that human conversion is low by some standards that are unclear. And, when you say it like that, it implies the whole argument for it is very weak. Like, what standards are we talking about when we say it's low? We'll get into this in a little bit. So, supplementation comes in a variety of forms, from seafood-based to even vegetarian products. The NIH Factsheet does warn about the methylmercury that is in seafood, but not supplements because it does get processed out. I'm not going to dive deeper into the types of supplements. I actually had a whole section talking about the different types, the absorption rates, but as I went deeper into the literature, it's clear these supplements may have a very minor benefit for very select few. But if you want to learn more, this fact sheet honestly does a pretty great job, and it's in line with the literature that I found and some of the literature I presented earlier. Oh, and here's a note that the phospholipid form in krill oil might actually have higher bioavailability, and for vegetarian, vegan forms, algae oil, it's likely equivalent to that from cooked salmon. Now, some people might say, well, you might as well take these as an insurance policy just in case. After all, most findings were mixed and new research could come out. And this is a very valid point to make. I'll raise a few arguments against this in a moment, but one of the simpler ones is simply that you might actually experience some very mild but still unpleasant side effects like bad breath, acid reflux, or even a headache. It's very strange how something that some people might take for their brain health may give them a headache, right? It doesn't seem to line up at what should be going on in there. Now, time to switch it up. Now, we're going to talk about what other experts have said. First, we have what I consider to be the world's greatest dietitian, Jeff Novick. And the reason I say that is he just has a special, talent or a special eye for the numbers. And when it comes to the numbers and looking at details, he's really unmatched. I have a screenshot from his fatty acids presentation where he talks about omega-3s. And the short story is that the adequate intake that we talked about earlier, it's very easy to meet when you average it right. It's not like you need to hit it every single day. Some days are higher based on what you eat and some days are lower. He also points out that compared to other even fish, salmon is not all that high as many people think it is. And then nuts and seeds besides chia, flax, and walnuts are a terrible source because you got way too many calories. And of course, you get a very high ratio of omega-6 to 3. And importantly, he presents the argument, well, how do other animals get enough? Not all animals are eating fish or algae or chia or flax or walnuts. And that leads us to our next expert. Let me use that drum roll effect one more time. Oh yeah, so much fun. Which is Dr. Peter Rogers. And I know some people are thinking, who are these people? Why should I care what they specifically have to say? And to that I'll say, honestly, forget who they are, forget who I am. Just look at the argument itself and the evidence presented by the articles and body of science as a whole. This is me just giving credit to the places where I got the ideas from. Anyways, let's walk through this logic. First question for you. What animals have more omega-3s? I'll let you think about this for 3, 2, 1. Well, as we saw earlier, fish, animals that live in the ocean have more omega-3s. But why? Well, I showed this earlier that omega-6s have more double bonds. You can see right over here. This one has 3 double bonds, this one has 2 double bonds, and that's the omega-3, right? From the omega end, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So more double bonds. And because of those more double bonds, it's more fluid. Specifically, more double bonds means it has a lower melting point, which is why foods in higher in saturated fats like butter or coconut are solid in the fridge and they start to melt in a hot room. You can see this on the table right here for different numbers of double bonds and their melting points. And if you're wondering why, the reason is simple. Oceans are freaking cold. I first learned this not by going to the ocean, but by watching the Titanic. It looked freaking freezing out there. And hence, you may need to have more double bonds, more fluidity. Knowing this, would you expect land animals to have high levels of omega-3s? No, of course not. You don't need it, right? More double bonds actually make the fatty acid membrane more prone to oxidation and going rancid, basically going bad, which is why flaxseed oil, which has a lot of omega-3s, is often stored in a dark bottle and refrigerated, right? And in the same way, oils in general are stored in dark bottles. Even some omega-3 supplements on the market are stored in refrigerated sections. But terrestrial land plants that make ALA, wouldn't these fatty acids just oxidize too? Well, as you can see by the slide here, to deal with this oxidation problem, they make antioxidants. Makes sense, right? And supplements sometimes have antioxidants like vitamin E added to them as well. Now I want to ask you, what happens when omega-3s enter your body? Think about your body temperature and whether you're an antioxidant-rich plant. Well, hotter than the ocean, lacking antioxidants, so it's likely more prone to oxidation and rancidity. This is the Peter Rogers argument. The other points have been said elsewhere, but I just want to credit Peter for bringing this to light for me to run into this and revisit this idea. This is a longer topic, but for optimal health and membrane function, you could make the argument that non-heated, non-oxidized essential fatty acids, so in other words, from whole foods, from raw foods, might actually be more optimal because these fatty acids end up making our membranes. So you might want them in the least heated form, which is raw, right? Steaming and boiling would be second, baking and frying would be last. I'll mention this again with some specifics towards the end of this lecture. There are some other considerations on the topic of omega-3s and supplementation. So premenopausal women tend to have a higher conversion of ALA to EPA and DHA. This is likely due to estrogen-enhanced catalyzation conversion for increased need of EPA DHA during pregnancy. I took that directly from the article there. So if you're planning on or are pregnant, this is something you might want to check out, the studies below. It also ties into my next point right here, that if you are vegan or vegetarian, this enhanced conversion during pregnancy would cover your needs, provided there's enough AOA coming in. And this is also why in these populations, you generally don't see issues with regarding to pregnancy and omega-3s versus, you could say, the omnivore population. Unsurprisingly, vegans have a higher ALA but lower EPA and DHA because they're consuming that sort of form before the conversion steps. And this study actually reported that vegetarians are similar to non-vegetarians, but you'll see some inconsistent findings with that. You'll also see that vegans typically have higher LA, likely from oils and processed foods they're consuming, which might actually explain that lower conversion. And interesting enough, studies have looked at not only RBCs, but also red blood cells, but also fat tissue, plasma, and even breast milk. You can check out that study below. But from what all this means and whether it's actually significant or not is unclear. But from where it does matter, vegans are reported to be at lower cardiovascular risk, which I wouldn't jump to the conclusion it's because of the higher ALA or omega-6, but it's likely due to the presence of more whole plant foods. Next consideration is trans fat. Although technically banned in many places, it's still created and it's in most people's diet. It's shown to inhibit the conversion of ALA to EPA and DHA by inhibiting that literally the first enzyme in this process. Which actually might also explain why vegans have higher ALA. Next consideration, and this is a major one I've brought up before, but where's the DHA going? A study using DHA found that you need at least 1,000 milligrams to see any significant increase in the brain, and this was measuring by cerebrospinal fluid. This was I mentioned earlier that I was going to present a study. This is a study that kind of shows that, and also was a big reason why I didn't dive further into this literature, because if you can't even get that DHA in the brain, then all your findings, your associated findings, they mean a hell of a lot less, at least to me. Also, keep in mind that most supplements do not have this high of a DHA dose. There may also be special considerations for athletes. This is just one study that I found, that's just as an example, that found more running distance had a lower omega-3 index. But it's actually hypothesized that this is because the training may move the DHA into the muscles, right? So there may be a special consideration for omega-3 supplementations for athletes that's just yet to be determined. And now we're going to get into my thoughts, and I want to use the drum roll before I do so. Da-na-na-na-na. Okay, my school of thought. Let's do it. My thoughts are really just a summary and synthesize not only what we covered today, but also based on my knowledge of living a healthy life. First, if you've had a heart attack or or at very high risk for a heart attack or stroke, and you're not planning on making any dietary changes whatsoever, talk to your doctor. I mean, you should probably talk to your doctor anyway. But some of these studies do pair statins or other medications with omega-3s. There may be a very small anti-clotting effect that likely won't prevent, you could say, misery, but could slightly delay it, or even the impact of a cardiovascular event, right? If you are suffering from autoimmune, you could try a supplement and see if there's any benefit. Do be careful taking these long term, as any suppression of the immune system is not a good idea with regards to cancer risk. If you're looking to optimize brain health, rest assured there's plenty of better and more proven ways. I'm actually going to have an interview with Dr. Rogers that's going to come out next week. The idea is based on this idea for omega-3s. It's based on correlation, not any proven causation, so you don't want to rely too heavily on that data. And this is very important to understand, that there's no guarantee you improve things by taking a supplement. You may actually make things worse, and that could be because of the oxidation problem. If you're concerned about membrane health, consider avoiding baking or air frying foods. Avoid that high dry heat and oxygen environment. And this is even for foods with a relatively low percent of calories coming from fat, say like less than under 20%. And if you're really looking to optimize things, foods less than 600 calories per pound should be trending towards raw, right? This improves that ratio, and it lets your body decide what and how much DHA or EPA to make, rather than trying to manipulate your body's natural physiology. It's generally a bad idea to try to manipulate your body's natural physiology. You want to live in line with it. Like we saw with higher conversion of ALA to EPA and DHA for menopausal women, you want to assume and you want to have some confidence that, hey, my body just knows what it's doing. Anyways, that is my school of thought on it. You can see that, of course, I have my own biases and they came out towards the end there, but I think I did a well enough job covering some of the key literature, and hopefully that helps you decide whether or not you want to supplement omega-3s. It's all about making better informed decisions for your own health goals, and I'm hoping this video plays a part in that. All right, we did it. I have a note here to hit C, so let's hit C. What does C do? Ooh, that's fun. Let's do a bit more. Anyways, if you have questions or concerns, please leave them in the comment section below. You can also reach me via email. My email address is right there, andy@basednutrition.com. If you that's good if you prefer to be anonymous or have a personal concern. If you enjoyed this lecture format, please share it with a friend or a loved one. Hit that subscribe button, because I'm planning on covering more topics in depth like this, like carbs, fat, protein, exercise, gut health. I actually have a lot of very interesting fresh points for that gut health one and that exercise one. This is Andy with Based Nutrition. Thanks again for checking out this video. Catch you on the next one.